Now, before we add a primary key to the enrollments table, let's talk about the relationship between the students and enrollments. Because here we have two options for adding a primary key in the enrollments table, and you will see that in a second. So here we need a one-to-many relationship between these two tables, so a student can have multiple enrollments. Here on the left side, you can see the icon for a one-to-many relationship. Now, whenever we add a relationship between two tables, one end of the relationship is called the parent or the primary key table, and the other end is called the child or the foreign key table. In this case, the students table is the parent or the primary key table because we cannot have an enrollment without having a student first. So the student is the parent, right? Now, when adding a relationship, here we need to select the foreign key table first. If you forget that, you can simply look at the status bar. The status bar says, select the table to receive the foreign key. So here I'm going to select the enrollments table first, and then I'm going to select the students table. Now, as you see, we have a one-to-many relationship between these two tables. Beautiful. Now, the moment I added this relationship, my SQL Workbench added a new column here, students, underline student, underline ID. This is basically telling us that this column is referencing the student ID column in the students table. So this is how we know who this enrollment is for. Anytime we insert a record in this table, we store the ID of that student in this column. Now, personally, I don't like this naming convention. I don't like to prefix this column with the reference table. Of course, there are situations where this clarifies the design, but in this case, I think it's unnecessary. So let's double click this table and rename this column to student ID. Now you can see that this column is marked with this red diamond because this is a foreign key in the enrollments table. So a foreign key is a column in one table that references the primary key of another table. Okay. Now let's close this window. We need to repeat this step one more time to add a relationship between these two other tables. So one more time, one-to-many. We select the foreign key table first and then the primary key table. So you can see we have another column here, courses, underline course, underline ID. Let's rename this as well. Okay, that is better. Once again, you can see in our physical model, we have more details than a logical model. At that level, we didn't have to worry about primary keys, foreign keys, because these are implementation details. Now we are ready to add a primary key in the enrollments table. And here we have two choices. One way is to use the combination of student ID and course ID to uniquely identify each enrollment. So we can use a composite primary key here. The other approach is to introduce a new column called enrollment ID, just like student ID and course ID. We can set it to auto increment. Which approach is better? It really depends. There is no hard and fast rule. The benefit of this composite primary key is that it prevents us from accidentally enrolling the same student in the same course twice, because the primary keys of a table cannot be repeated. They have to be unique. Each primary key uniquely identifies each record in a given table. So if we use a composite primary key here, we can prevent bad data from being inserted into this table. That's the benefit. What's the problem? The problem is that if we have another table in the future, and there's going to be a relationship between the enrollments and that new table, these two keys need to be repeated in that table as the foreign key, just like the student ID in this table. So when we added a relationship between the students table and enrollments table, MySQL automatically added the student ID column here as the foreign key. So if we add another table here in the future and establish a parent to child relationship between these two tables, these two keys will have to be repeated in that table. Now, depending on the context, this is not always a bad thing. Depends on the amount of data that you have and whether that table also has another child table. Now, on the other side, if we introduce a new column here like enrollment ID, we're not going to have that problem. So if you have another table here in the future and there is a parent to child relationship between enrollments and that table, we only have to repeat the enrollment ID. So we're repeating one value, one integer instead of two integers. Okay. However, currently we don't have such a table in our design. So there is no need to design for what if scenarios that may never happen in the future. So in this case, I personally prefer to use a composite primary key here because we get this immediate benefit. We can protect this table from bad data. And honestly, we don't really have that child table here, so we don't have to worry about these two keys being repeated somewhere else. If that happens in the future, we can always come back and revisit this design. We can write a change script to update the design of our tables, and that's not a big deal. So let's double click this table and move these two columns on the top. So move up. I know this is really painful. So, all right. Now we tick the primary key checkbox for each of these columns. And this gives us a composite primary key.